Hi, everyone. This is Mrs. Tripp. I'm here to continue the conversation around ancient Greece. The other day, Mrs. Lumsden talked to you about the geography and how it impacted this region and the development of it. And I'm going to continue the conversation from there. The map in front of you obviously is of the region, but I just wanted to point out a couple things to you. You'll notice the major seas: Ionian Sea, Mediterranean Sea, and Aegean Sea. And those are really going to be beneficial to this area in that it's going to allow for the Greek civilization to really thrive in trade. Now, we know that the geography of this region, it's very mountainous, and we know that the mountains were great for protecting Greeks from foreigners, from foreign attacks, but they were also made it difficult for the Greeks to unite because they isolated these small groups of Greeks that had to establish their own little um, communities. And it would be very difficult for them to unite because of these mountains. Now, the earliest of these groups is called the Minoans, and they lived on the Mediterranean island of Crete. And if you look at the map in the bottom, circled in red, is the island of Crete. One thing you should recognize right away is that because of its location on the Mediterranean Sea, it's really going to have access to a lot of other places in this region. And that is going to allow them to have really good trade. So this region has a Mediterranean climate that is really good for growing of vineyards and olive trees. And that's exactly what the Minoans did. And they were able to then trade those items along with honey, export them all throughout the Mediterranean Sea. By about 2000 BCE, they will dominate the Eastern Mediterranean trade. They will thoroughly control it. But around 1628, there is a massive tidal wave that's actually created by a volcanic eruption, and it wipes out many of their coastal communities. And with these communities being wiped out, you'll start to see a slow decline for the Minoans. And by 1400 BCE, they were not as strong, and a group of people called the Mycenaeans were able to come in and conquer them. The Mycenaeans were the first advanced civilization on the Greek mainland, and they were their center was the city of Mycenae, and they were headed by a king. This map shows you Mycenae is boxed in there in red. That's exactly where they were located on mainland Greece. They also had a really good trade network once they took over, and their big items to trade were bronze weapons and pottery. Now, the Mycenaeans were also known for um, wars and using those bronze weapons for wars, but their most famous war was against Troy, and it was called the Trojan War. This war lasted 10 years, and in order to end the war, the Mycenaeans actually tricked the Trojans. What they did was they brought this massive wooden horse onto their land, into Troy, or outside of the city gates, and then they left on their ships. But what the Trojans didn't know is that there were some Mycenaean soldiers hiding inside of this massive horse. So after the rest of the soldiers sailed away, the Trojans thought it was safe and pulled this large horse inside the city gates. At nighttime, those soldiers that had sailed away come back, and the ones that were inside of the horse, including Odysseus, who is their great warrior leader, they sneak out, they open the gates, to allow the rest of their army in, and they completely obliterate the city of Troy and actually burn it to the ground and win the war. Now, eventually, though, as you know, the Mycenaeans, as everyone does in these times, will begin to decline. And when this happened, the Dorians come in from the north with their iron weapons, which are obviously better than the bronze ones, and they conquer the Greek mainland and end up ruling this area for about 300 years. The Greeks that were there, they fled to they fled the mainland and settled in Ionia. They went across the Aegean Sea. The period that the Dorians are in control for 300 years is called the Dark Age. So first I'm going to show you this map where Ionia is. You can see that is on the right-hand side, boxed in red. That's where the Greeks fled to. Now let's go back to why it's called the Dark Age. It's called the Dark Age because as the Mycenaeans declined, so did the Greek culture in that area. And not just the Greek culture, but everything, their language, their literature. They stopped building cities. They didn't make art or music. They even stopped trading. And poverty just really increased. It was a very dark time. And that's why it's called the Dark Age, because there was so much negative and lack of a community thriving. Now, the Greeks that went to Ionia, they brought their culture with them and they tried to keep it alive as best as they could. And what they did was they would tell stories about the great Mycenaeans, including the story about how they defeated Troy in the Trojan War. And the story, because there was no written language at the time, they forgot how to write. Eventually people stopped writing, so it didn't continue. Their story would be carried on over time, passed on by word of mouth, which we know what happens with that. Eventually, there's some shifts to that story, right? Well, eventually, it is going to get written down by the Greek author Homer in these two epic poems. Now, epic poems, they're called epic because they are so long and it's almost like a book. And it really is this great story. It's not this short poem. But keep in mind, we know that this was an oral history for a long time. And so Homer writes this story and it's considered a poem and instead of a documentary per se. The two stories, the two poems he wrote were the Iliad, which tells the story of the actual war, and the Odyssey, which describes the adventures of the war hero Odysseus. And actually, it tells more, it's all about his journey back from fighting this war and these various adventures he experiences on the way. These stories will greatly impact Greek culture. The ancient Greeks, they tried to live up to these values of these warriors that are expressed in these poems, the value of bravery, strength, and honor. And it really comes to identify who they are as people. Okay, so let me tell you what you are going to do next. You are going to read and complete some guided notes, and you're just going to read the first two sections in the lesson one e-text. The sections you're going to read are how did geography shape the Greek world and who influenced the early Greeks. Now, while you read this, you should also be completing these guided notes that are shared with you on Google Classroom. The purpose of the guided notes is to help you explain your understanding of the reading, so it's really best if you do it at the same time.